Welcome to NeuroDiverse Voices, Breaking Barriers and Embracing Differences. This series explores the intersection between culture and neurodiversity with a focus on amplifying the voices and perspectives of individuals with neurodiverse traits or conditions. It aims to promote greater understanding and acceptance of neurodiverse individuals and communities and to empower them to share their stories and perspectives with the world. In this episode, I have the pleasure of hosting Dyan Robson, an advocate for hyperlexia and autism. Dyan shares her journey of navigating hyperlexia as a diagnosis. We dive into deeper discussions about this precocious ability of reading, the strengths, challenges, and everything in between. Let's hear from Dyan on this obsession with letters and gain valuable insights into the world of hyperlexia. Hi, Dyan. Welcome to the Nourish by NBNPodcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
How are you doing tonight?
I'm pretty well. How about yourself?
Doing very well. It looks like we are well coordinated.
Yeah, no kidding.
Let's start with your personal journey. Would you share some of your experiences with neurodiversity?
Okay, so actually my experiences with it kind of started even before I had kids. I actually worked for a family as a nanny, and I was hired to help this boy out who at the time they suspected he was maybe autistic, but he just was at that point sensory processing disorder was kind of the label he was given. So he was kind of like my first introduction to working with someone with some sensory differences, and I got to help him out in the classroom. So that was about a year or two before I started having kids. So he was kind of my first experience. I like to say he kind of helped pave the way for my firstborn, who is my autistic and hyperlexic one. So he's the one that kind of, really, it was my first kid. I didn't know what to expect. And here I had, he was growing a little bit differently. And so, that was kind of my introduction to neurodiversity. Was I was just kind of thrown right into it.
Yeah. So how did you navigate? Did he, because of your previous experience with working with a child with autism, did you go for the diagnosis, or did you and your family try to figure out what's going on, or how did you navigate your journey?
Yeah. So this is really interesting because I was really aware that he had some differences, right? Like I could really pick up on some of those sensory things because of the boy that I had worked with previous to having my own kids. But everything I read didn't quite seem to explain my son, right? Like I could see some autistic traits. I could see some of the sensory differences, but nothing I read explained the reading part, right? Because here I had this 2-year-old who taught himself to read out of nowhere. So I tried finding things and nothing could describe that. So I was just like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what to do with this kid except give him more letters and more numbers. So that was kind of just I was thinking he could be autistic, but I'm not sure. And it wasn't till a couple of years later when my second child was born where I started to notice, okay, I can have a little bit more of a conversation with my, at that point, 2-year-old versus my 4-year-old. And so it was at that point where I said, I think we need to really consider, exploring an autism diagnosis for him. And then that kind of got the ball rolling. We spoke to our doctor and went for an assessment. And then that's when we finally found the word we were looking for, which was that hyperlexia piece. So that was kind of our journey.
Yeah. And I have come across some parents trying to figure out, what hyperlexia means, because usually it's they're starting to read at a very early age. They're understanding letters at a very early age. So it's kind of confusing. Is it good or is it bad, or, what's going on? So for our viewers out there, can you elaborate on the term hyperlexia? What does it mean and what does it come along with?
Yeah, for sure. So hyperlexia refers to a precocious self-taught ability to read, and it's usually very, very early. It can be anywhere before age 5, but usually it's around age 2 or 3. For my son, that was just before his second birthday. So quite early, quite shocking, especially as a first child. And usually hyperlexia comes with some comprehension difficulties and some language differences, as well as some social differences. And it's usually identified along something else. Usually it's autism, because most hyperlexic kids are also autistic. Not all, but most will be. So it's more than just that early reading piece, though. A lot of people kind of get stuck on that. Oh, all early readers must be hyperlexic ones. But that's not necessarily the case. There's a few other traits that kind of have to be in place for it to be considered hyperlexia versus just an early reader.
Okay. So give us an overview of your expertise with hyperlexia.
Okay. So I didn't hear of this term till, I guess it was 2014 when my son was identified. And it was at that point I typed into Google, like most people would do. And there was some information, but not a lot. And there definitely wasn't anything practical that I could use as a parent to kind of help my child. Like I could find a few research studies. I was able to finally find like a support group on Facebook, but that was kind of it. And so I was like really bummed out about this, because here I finally had this term I'd been looking for years, but no information to go with it, no resources. So I already had my blog established at this point, and I thought, there's probably other parents who are in the same boat as me, who are Googling hyperlexia or my toddler can read, what does this mean? And find nothing. So I wanted to kind of help fill that gap, and I started sharing about my experiences and doing as much research as I could to truly understand what hyperlexia means and how to best support my son, and then just relay that information to others so that, that there's teachers and speech therapists and other parents out there who know what it is, so that they too can help these kids as they discover them, whether that's on their caseload or in their classroom. So that's kind of my experience with hyperlexia. It's kind of all just like, I just dove right in and researched it as much as I could so that I could understand my son a lot better.
Yeah. And I mean, you've definitely an expert now in hyperlexia, I would say. You did touch upon this a little bit earlier. How did you become aware about hyperlexia as such? Like, yes, early reading ability, definitely. But what were some other signs or behaviors that stood out to you?
Yeah. So it's fun to look back at this. I was talking about this with my husband earlier, some of the early signs that we saw. Before he started reading, it was that intense, very, very intense. Like I can't even describe how intense it was. Interest and fascination with letters and numbers. So it just was constantly playing with letters and numbers all day long. He would sing the ABCs like on repeat. He just gravitated to anything that had letters written on them. And so that was around 17, 18 months. And then looking back, right, I can see even signs earlier than that where, he had a lot of echolalic speech, right? He was repeating things back versus generating, spontaneous language. And he also was just so incredibly gentle with books. Even as a baby, I have this photo of him when he was about 4.5 months old, and he had just learned how to sit up, and he's sitting there flipping a page just so carefully.
Oh, wow.
That's very unusual if you think about how most babies and toddlers are with books, right? They're maybe ripping pages or gnawing on the book, but not my son. He was sitting there just extremely fascinated by what was written on the pages and just kind of absorbing it all. So yeah, those would be kind of the early signs we noticed. And then, shortly after he started reading, it was just, he would spell everything on the floor in letter magnets. It was kind of entertaining to find random messages on the floor like that.
Yeah. So did you face any challenges about, he is reading early, so that's a good sign. And then now how to figure out how to, make him understand those concepts or navigate that journey. So would you mind sharing some challenges that you came across?
Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges we had, especially when he was younger, was just the communication part and having conversations. there wasn't a lot of back and forth conversations because, he was relying on his favorite scripts and echolalic phrases. So anytime you asked a WH question too, that was really challenging. He would get his pronouns reversed. So he would always talk about himself in third person, kind of. So you would just notice some of those kind of unusual language differences, which with, lots of modeling and practice, and even just with age, those things kind of resolved on their own. And then, the comprehension piece is a huge part of some of the struggles with hyperlexic kids, is just understanding, what they're reading in particular. So making inferences, idioms, those kind of things where you have to kind of read between the lines, there's still a bit of a challenge. And especially in the early elementary years. He's a teenager now, so we don't have as many comprehension issues, but
yes, definitely comprehension is a huge part of it. Any other areas from your expertise now that you've gained, any other areas does hyperlexia impact, in terms of development?
It can impact social skills. They do have slightly different social skills than, a quote unquote neurotypical child would. So you might notice that they play a little bit different, like they might prefer to play alone. They just have a harder time navigating some of the conversations. And we do still see that now. Like my son says quite often, like, I don't really know how to talk to other people or how to be around other people. And that's okay, right?
So that's a preference.
And he still would rather play by himself or do things by himself. I mean, so do I.
And it's a preference, I would say. I mean,
so really I don't see it as like a bad thing or anything. It's just that, like you said, a preference.
Does it affect handwriting or fine motor abilities in any way?
There are some kids that maybe, but in our experience, it didn't really impact that. It was just mostly, writing assignments were a challenge, not like actual handwriting part, but anytime he had to express himself was really challenging, especially for open-ended assignments. And this even applied to like art projects and stuff, right? He would rather just draw numbers and letters versus a tree or a house or whatever the art project was supposed to be. So anything that was kind of like open-ended where he had to express an idea, there was definitely some challenges and struggles there, but with practice he did get better at it.
And I am curious about, this question just hit my mind right now. So does he do better with relations, as in like analyzing things or mathematical abilities or calculations as such, than understanding the language and context behind it?
So it's interesting that you bring up the math part, because he also has what's called hypernumeracy, which is, think of it like hyperlexia, but for numbers and math. So he's picked up on math patterns and all of these amazing, wonderful skills, even from a young age, right? So I didn't have to teach him how to read. I didn't have to teach him how to do math. He just kind of did it all. And so, he's just really, really excellent with those math things and numbers, and just, it's incredible to watch. Now, having said that, not every hyperlexic kid is going to have that hypernumeracy piece, but he's fortunate that he does, and it gives him this incredible ability to understand numbers and math, and just it's very hard to keep him challenged with math some days.
I get that. So I'm going to save this hypernumeracy conversation, because that's a huge topic by itself. But so when you were facing these challenges, what helped? What interventions helped, or what strategies helped?
Okay, so the biggest thing, since he could read, was just to kind of use that ability to our benefit, right? Like we just started writing everything down. We had whiteboards, chalkboards, boogie boards. I don't know if you know what they are, but they're kind of like little portable mini whiteboards. Actually. like a little writing a tablet kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we used to write down everything. We would do visual schedules, timers, because he loved the numbers, right? We tried to incorporate all that kind of stuff. We made everything as visual as possible because we saw that he really gravitated towards those and he understood it better when it was written down. Now there is this mantra in the hyperlexia community that, when in doubt, write it out, because our kids will read whatever you put in front of them. So that's kind of the biggest tip that you want to keep in mind, is to write everything down, because they're going to read it and use that to your advantage.
Sure. And in terms of getting the context behind it, understanding the who questions or what questions. So was it along the same lines, like you would write it down and then like go step by step, or break it down and explain the meanings of it?
Yeah. So we kind of do a lot of that stuff. We break down a lot of things for him into lots of little steps, and just so that he can understand all the individual moving pieces, because sometimes, we pick up on some of those underlying or hidden, steps that aren't necessarily explained. But if you can explain them and break them down, that's extremely helpful. And same with, those WH questions, they're really challenging for hyperlexic kids. We would explain, okay, here's the question, who. When you see that, that means they're asking about a person, or it might be asking about an animal sometimes, right? But usually it's referring to a person. And then we would do the same thing with when and what. We would just like explain and show him, okay, this is when you would use those. And just practicing different types of questions, like even just knock jokes were a really great way to practice those things. And we would even write out, especially when he was really little, like common scripts that, when you meet someone, it's kind of like, what's your name? How old are you? We would practice by writing down, I am blank years old, and he could fill in however old he was. Or if they asked, what's your name? He'd be like, my name is, and then he just had to say his name. So teaching him those like repetitive questions and giving him those written scripts that he could just then use in those different situations really made a huge difference anytime, especially when questions were involved.
Yeah, so I'm getting like a lot of visual supports for helping. Repetition was helping a lot. And usually from research, hyperlexia has been closely associated with autism, or, there's a high co-occurrence with autism. So from your expertise, what can you share about that?
Yeah, so there's a really great research paper from 2017, and it kind of just reviewed all the hyperlexia literature. And they found that 84% of hyperlexic individuals are autistic or have autistic-like traits and maybe aren't, identified as autistic yet. So it is a really strong link between the two. And there are some experts that even argue that it has to be with autism. And then there's some that are saying, well, it could be with other things like ADHD or apraxia, or there's a whole list of other things that it can be identified alongside with. But I find most of the time kids are being diagnosed with autism and hyperlexia. It's kind of just that, that little twist added to the autism. It's they usually go hand in hand together, but not every hyperlexic kid is going to be autistic, and not every autistic kid is hyperlexic. So there is definitely overlap. And
And just in terms of hyperlexia, do they also face emotional difficulties? I mean, understanding emotions or expressing feelings like individuals with autism?
Yeah, there definitely can be some, challenges with self-regulation and learning about emotions. Hyperlexic kids also usually have unusual fears. Like my son had fears about bathtubs being filled when he was really little, and then clouds and weather was a big one. But I've heard from other families where like certain songs can be really, really scary for them. Like the Happy Birthday song is one. Judge Judy was like another example. But yeah, unusual fears seems to be quite common with hyperlexic kids.
Well, this is very interesting. I never knew about this.
I'm full of good tidbits like that.
Yeah. So now how about some aha moments? Like, that you were surprised while he was growing up and, you watching him, certain times he would just surprise you with his behaviors or things he was doing.
Well, obviously, the biggest thing was when he shocked us by reading.
Yeah.
I remember I was in his room by his bunk bed, and when I saw what he had done, I stood up and I banged my head on the bunk bed. I was just like, what is happening? It was just so shocking. So that was kind of the first aha moment. But some other aha moments were kind of like just how quickly he picks up things. Like you just show him once and he's just like, he gravitates towards it and just remembers it for a very, very long time. Another thing was when we would used to watch movies, instead of, requesting it by the name of the show, he would actually refer to it by the movie's runtime. So he would say, I want to watch 1:23:56 or whatever, right down to the seconds. And we had to watch the movie from the very start all the way to the end of the credits because, movie credits are full of letters. So it's very motivating for hyperlexic kids. So those kind of things were just very like, they really just catch you by surprise. Another one I can think of was, he might have been like 5 or 6 at the time. And he was pointing out that the street lamps in our area have numbers on them. And like, I've never noticed this before. So he's just like, he gives such a unique perspective to viewing the world that, he's catching details that I would otherwise miss. So it's really, really fun to experience and, see how he sees the world.
Yeah. So like he catches all the finer details, the minutest details in the room.
Yeah, it's very interesting what he picks up on, whether that's the movie runtime or the numbers on the street lamps.
Yeah. So like, for a parent who is, who suspects something is going on because my child is, learning faster or, grasping letters at a very early age, and there might be hyperlexia, I'm not sure, kind of a thing. How do they go about getting a diagnosis?
Yeah, so this is a big challenge. So hyperlexia isn't an official diagnosis. It is more of a practical label that describes a very unique learning style. So you can't really get a diagnosis of it on paper, but you can get it as part of like an autism assessment, and it can be written in saying that, yes, we think he or she might be a hyperlexic learner, and here's what that means. And that was the case for us, right? We went for an autism assessment. He got his autism diagnosis, and then they said, oh, yes, he also has hyperlexia and hypernumeracy. So we actually have it written down on paper, but that seems to be a very unusual and rare occurrence because it's just not a recognized, or official diagnosis. It's just something to describe how they learn and their unique ability to just read spontaneously like they do.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So did you get supports in the school system when he was learning at school? Or was it like you had to, after school or go get supports from outside through centers?
Yeah. So we did have a little bit of support at school, not a lot. It took a lot of advocating just to get even the bare.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for any other parent that might be listening, like it's very important that you are advocating for your kids' needs at the school because they're never familiar with hyperlexia, right? Like it's very unusual to run into someone who's even heard of it. So it's really important that you communicate to the school, like, okay, here's what my child can do. Here's where they need support. Here's what they find helpful within the classroom, right? For me, that's saying, write things down as much as possible, or, give him written instructions, give him very clear instructions, right? Don't miss any obvious steps. So yeah, that's kind of what we had to rely on, is just me advocating as much as possible, and then supplementing at home here and there as needed, especially for math, where we frequently have to keep him challenged because he seems to finish everything at school so quickly and so easily.
Wow. Sure. And I have come across parents reaching out to me who are like, don't know about the diagnosis as such, right? So that's a huge challenge, I think, to get the support in the first place, because it's not so well known. Or, it has to, even in the professional community, there has to be some awareness about it, or some courses or trainings to be done. But I have also seen a lot of evidence-based practices that work for autism also work for hyperlexia, because like you were describing about visual supports or task analysis, like breaking down in simple steps, repetition, those practices, they work really, really well for kids with autism. And from what I'm hearing from you, seems like they're working so much well for kids with hyperlexia as well.
Yeah, and that's very true, right? Because there's so much overlap between the two. It makes sense. And it's just the key difference with hyperlexia is making sure that it's written out, right? Because of the letters and the numbers. Or some other common interests are kind of like logos, geography. So even like leveraging those in some way in your visuals can really make a huge difference. And I think that's the key, is just to tailor it to that specific child and their unique learning style. So in my son's case, it's all about letters and numbers. So we had to include that as much as possible into those visual supports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And since child with hyperlexia might be so fascinated with the letters, I am assuming there won't be any issues with orientation or understanding the letter formation as such.
I've never encountered it, but I know there are some hyperlexic kids who, might actually struggle with spelling. Most are really great at it because they can, maybe see it in their mind, or they've spelt it many times with their letters, but sometimes they aren't, able to. I know that spelling like uses a different process than reading does, and that can explain some of that. But yeah, as to your specific question, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, that's why I was intrigued on the relation or co-occurrence of like learning disability versus hyperlexia, or having them together.
Well, that's a great question, because a lot of times people describe hyperlexia as the opposite of dyslexia.
Yeah.
And usually when you're reading, research papers about hyperlexia, there is mentions of dyslexia too, because there is kind of these, opposite profiles between the two. But then I don't know, is there kind of like some kind of abilities between hyperlexia and dyslexia that you could maybe have a little both? I really don't know. And there isn't the research to kind of support that. But yeah, it is interesting because so many people are like, yeah, it's like dyslexia, but the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So have you come across any misconceptions surrounding hyperlexia?
Because most people haven't heard of it, it's not too often I encounter some. But I know there have been a few over the years. Like when I first tried to describe it to some parent at school, they were like, oh, so then he can pick like my winning lottery numbers or something. I'm like, well, no, that's not really the thing. And, sometimes there's a lot of big expectations put on kids like my son because, well, he can read. I'm like, well, yes, but I mean, there are some challenges that come along with his hyperlexia too. So I think it's just more, not necessarily myths or misconceptions, but people just, they don't understand it because they're not familiar with it. So they have questions that, maybe you're supposed to come off as jokes, but don't really come off as jokes. And then just setting unrealistic expectations sometimes for my son because, well, he must be able to do everything else because look what he can do, So just that kind of pressure.
So in terms of IQ, do they usually have a higher IQ, or, I mean, it's assumable that they might have a higher IQ because they learn so fast?
Yeah. And actually, if you dig into the research, it seems to be kind of a little bit all over the place. It doesn't necessarily mean high IQ, which I think is really fascinating because a lot of people would just necessarily assume that must be the case. But no, sometimes their IQ can just be, fairly average or typical for their age.
Yeah. So children with hyperlexia will have communication or speaking skills that might be impacted, right, or below their age level. But they do have these abilities, of excellent memory, or capturing the visuals in the room, or relating numbers, or understanding those concepts which are more concrete than abstract. So for your child, now he's a teenager, has he thought of what career he want to pursue, or which way he's want to go
Yeah.
forward with?
For as long as I can remember, it's always been something video game related, right? Whether that's a video game tester or a developer, I could foresee, for sure see him going into something very number related because he's just very motivated and very interested in those. So yeah, I think it'll probably be that, or maybe something video game related, like he hopes.
Yeah, even coding or
Yeah.
getting into IT.
Yeah, and we've done some coding with him before, and he just like picks up on it super quick. So
Yeah, and now let's move into the interesting letters on your wall. And next comes L.
yes.
So what's that all about?
Okay, so well, I know it's a very unusual name for my blog, but it's based off kind of a running joke in my family. So my oldest son, his name starts with J. My younger son, his name starts with K. So people are like, oh, J, K, and next comes L, right? So, and my blog is kind of my third baby, but there's other meanings to it. So my name is very unusual. It's spelled Dyan, but growing up, I've always been called Dylan. People see my name and they automatically put an L in it. So there's just something about the letter L that just kind of, I don't know, it just seems to relate to my life and my story. So it's a very fitting title. And I like to joke now that the L actually stands for letters as well. So, first we had this kid and all of a sudden it was letters and then it was reading. So it's just kind of a fun play on all of those things.
Yeah, a very, very interesting name, though.
Yeah, I know. It's not one that exactly rolls off the tongue, but it has a lot of meaning to me.
Yeah. And next comes L is on hyperlexia, right? It's a blog on strategies or tips on hyperlexia.
Well, actually, it originally started as a blog about sensory activities and crafts and whatnot. And then about 2 years into it is when I started to write about hyperlexia and autism. And now I focus mostly on providing tips and printables and activities to kind of do with your hyperlexic kid and to better understand them and better support them, whether that's at home or at school.
So what are the different, I know there are different types of hyperlexia as well. So what are the differences in those three types?
Okay, so there's actually more than 3 types, depending on who you talk to. Yeah, there's some research that they've identified 5 types. There's other research that I think it's 2 types. And then the most famous is the 3 types by Dr. Daryl Treffert. I think that's how you say his name. And yeah, so he proposed 3 types. I'm going to be upfront. I'm not a huge fan of these types. They're just one proposed theory, and I think they're kind of dated. And there's a lot of, experts, especially in that research paper that I talked about before about that kind of summarized some hyperlexia research. There's some things in there too that just kind of show, why those 3 types might not be good. But I will share the information anyways. So type 1 is hyperlexic. Hold up. I'm going to have to refresh. Hyperlexic, but otherwise like neurotypical, so they don't really, you know, have any additional challenges. So they're bright children who just read early. So in my mind, I'm like, well, why are we classifying them as a, a subtype, right? Like, why are we
Yeah. Because when I
pathologizing?
read those three types, I was confused. I'm like, I don't really get the difference.
Yeah. Yeah. So type 1 is just your early reader. Type 2 is your autistic children who have hyperlexia as a splinter skill, which hyperlexia to me is not a splinter skill. There's a lot of people who also agree with that and say, no, it's not a splinter skill. And then there's type 3 who they read early and they have autistic-like traits, but are not considered autistic. Now, is that because they just haven't been properly identified? Is that because these kids have learned to mask their autism? That's the thing, right? So this is part of the reason why the three types can be problematic, but they're helpful for a lot of families because they're like, well, I have this kid who's hyperlexic but not autistic, so they find it a little bit easier to classify and understand their child. So I mean, I can't discount that at all, but it's just, I don't know, I think they cause a little bit too many problems.
Yeah, and I also feel like there's a lot of overlap or the gray areas.
Yeah, well, yeah, like for example, like with the type 3, if they have autistic like traits, I'm like, well, wouldn't that make them autistic? Like if they have the traits, it's wording things like that it's just, okay, maybe these three types are just a product of their time, right? They were proposed, I think, in the 80s or 90s. So it's just, maybe they're just dated.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And now that you have been on this journey, with neurodiversity, so how has that journey changed your perspective, towards neurodiversity or embracing differences in people?
It's a really good question because I like to think that, I've always been pretty good at, appreciating differences and unique abilities. But at the same time, I think it has made me a lot more patient. And, there's a lot of pressure to ask kids questions and hope they respond right away. But now I'm more like, no, let's give them all the time they need, right? Because I know from my son's experience, if you jump in too early, like you haven't even given him time to process the question. So I think in a way it's just made me a lot more, patient and understanding of how other people learn and experience the world. And it just, I think that's the best way to put it, is just patient and more understanding.
Yeah. So like from the blog, do you also share, I know you have parent groups or support groups that you conduct. So are they more on strategies, or are they more like a space for parents to share their experiences? What kind of groups are they?
Yeah, so it's actually a monthly virtual support group where it's just a Q&A essentially. And the idea behind it was just to give people a chance to connect with other parents who kind of get what it's like to raise a hyperlexic child, right? Because it's very hard to find someone locally who would have experience with it. So this just gives you an opportunity if that isn't an option. So, we've had people join from Indonesia. We've had people, elsewhere in Canada like me. And we also have, a lot of regular people who are attending who are from the States. So yeah, it's just an opportunity to, ask those burning questions about, why is my kid doing this? What might be next? How do I advocate for him in preschool? That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So are you also aware of any specific resources or any support groups or any other organizations that, individuals with hyperlexia or parents looking for support for their kids can reach out to or look for?
Yeah, so there's not a lot out there, surprise, but there is I guess, an organization out of Chicago. They're called Chat. And as far as I know, they still do some hyperlexia consultations, because one of the experts, Phyllis Kupperman or Cooperman, I'm not 100% sure how to say her last name. She was working out of there. She's retired now. And she has a lot of background with Hyperlexia. So that is a really great organization to get in touch with if you're, especially if you're in the States and you don't really have any other options for, learning about hyperlexia. And then of course, there's me on my website. I'm sharing information too. So I'm always a good stepping stone too if you're looking for more information and just, are unsure of where to go next. I can usually guide people in the direction to go.
So if somebody asks you on the fly, give me some quick tips. You meet some parent on the road or, an individual with hyperlexia on the road and asking you if you're an expert, having conversation. So what would be some really quick tips on the go that you would give to them?
Yeah, there's generally, I like to keep it to three pieces of advice I always like to share. One is just learn everything you can about hyperlexia and related conditions. So, that could include autism, that can include sensory processing, and even Gestalt learning or Gestalt language processing.
Yeah.
Why can't I not get that right? Gestalt language processing. That's because hyperlexic kids, they learn language a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. And if you learn about that, I think it just it's like a light bulb moment. It really provides clarity for, how they're learning language. So that would be tip number one, is just learn as much as you can about hyperlexia and anything related to it. Tip number two is just write down everything, right? Make it visual, turn on the closed captions, turn on subtitles, use visual schedules, keep a notebook handy with you at all times to write down things for your child. And then tip number three is encourage their interests and follow their lead. Mm-hmm. So they really, really love letters. They really, really love numbers or logos or whatever interest. Embrace it. Go all in. Let them explore it. I know there's been a lot of parents who've received advice from professionals before saying, oh, take away the letters or limit the letters. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not really great advice, because these letters and numbers are how our kids can express themselves and communicate, and even it helps them regulate, right? Like just playing with these letters and numbers. Yes. So that would be my three things I always tell anyone who's new to hyperlexia and they're like, well, what can I do to support my child?
Yeah, great tips. So just would you elaborate a little bit on Gestalt language learning program?
Okay, so it's a way of developing language. Usually most kids learn language one word at a time and then they kind of piece it together, right? With Gestalt language processors, they learn language as a chunk, right? So think echolalia, right? They learn like a script or a chunk of language. And that's how hyperlexic kids learn.
Yeah.
So they will learn in the chunk and then they need to learn how to break it apart. So this is why we end up with things like pronoun reversals in hyperlexia, because they're just repeating back what they heard versus trying to manipulate it and break it apart and rearrange the parts. They're just not at that stage yet. So it's something that wasn't well discussed until very recently. Like you can find a lot more information about it, but it's how hyperlexic kids learn language. And it's just a very important piece to learn about so that you can kind of truly understand, why is my kid, scripting so much, and, what can I do to help them? It's just, you have to learn about that Gestalt language processing.
That's a really good advice, I would say, for parents who are looking for resources. And we're almost towards the end. Just one last question. In your opinion, how can the society become more aware or more accepting or more inclusive of individuals with hyperlexia and their families?
It's a great question. I would just love to see more information about hyperlexia being shared in general. There's certainly a lot more being discussed now than there was even 8 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's just, talking about, differences in children and in sharing that, we all have these unique journeys. And, for us, it just means our kids are learning to read early, but we still have to support their language in other ways. it doesn't necessarily mean that, everything else is going to go super quick and easy, right? It's just not the case. So in order to get there, we just need more people to know what hyperlexia is and just be familiar with it and know what to look for, especially, for professionals. It's really helpful if we can find, someone who believes us when we say, yeah, my 2-year-old can read, right? It would be nice for someone to be like, oh, okay, I know what that is versus, yeah, sure. Right. Because we get that a lot where, we're not believed because it does seem unbelievable, right? That a 2-year-old could just be reading, but I mean, that was our reality.
Yeah. And I get that because I mean, as a therapist, right, even I wasn't aware about it before. I think 2 or 3 years before I didn't know what hyperlexia was, right? Because I never came across it as a diagnosis or, as a neurodivergent trait.
Yeah.
So,
and that's the thing too. Like I remember I took a special education course. Oh gosh, this must be about 12, 13 years ago. And my textbook had 2 sentences dedicated to hyperlexia. 2. That's it. So I'm not surprised that most people haven't heard of it. But yeah, if it could be, shared about more and, just even if people had the word in their vocabulary, it would be a great starting point.
right.
They don't need to know all the ins and outs of it. They just need to know that it exists and it's very real and believe parents, when we tell them, hey, my kid is doing this.
Yeah. And, definitely now the world is moving towards more of a neurodiversity affirming practice, or that neurodiversity is not something abnormal. I mean, we're moving from the notion of abnormal to like, diverse traits, and everybody learns in a different learning pattern. Everybody has their own abilities and challenges like anyone else, right? I mean, even me, I wouldn't be good at some things and I would be great at some things, right? So just looking at it from that viewpoint, and embracing the individuals for who they are would also make it a lot easier to identify how to support them.
For sure.
It was a great time talking to you. I did learn a lot about hyperlexia, and you're doing great work. And next comes Elle sharing resources, tips, strategies. So for any parents who want to reach out to, I'm definitely going to point towards the website. And do you also do consulting or coaching?
Yeah, I do offer one-on-one parent coaching calls. So if you have questions and you're just not really sure where to start, yeah, you can reach out and we can connect and we can talk a little bit more about what hyperlexia means and, how to support your hyperlexic child. So yes, I do offer the one-on-one coaching calls.
Sure. And I will input all the details towards the end of the video for anybody who's looking for resources. Once again, thank you so much, Dyan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.